He was 12 years old, working in a boiler cellar that was more like a coffin than a workplace. Surrounded by total darkness, drenched in engine oil, he spent 12 hours a day firing a steam engine that he was terrified would explode and kill him. His pay for a week of this torture was $1.20. He was a starving Scottish refugee, a boy so small for his age that he had to stand on a crate to reach the machinery, dismissed by the locals as nothing more than gutter trash destined to rot in the slums of Pennsylvania. Yet, that same terrified boy would grow up to possess a personal fortune that, adjusted for inflation, dwarfs the net worth of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos combined. He would own the steel skeleton of America, every bridge, every skyscraper, every railroad track. How did a child who went to sleep hungry in a rat-infested attic become the man who literally owned half of America? This is the story of Andrew Carnegie. To understand the fire that burned inside Andrew Carnegie, you have to taste the cold ash of his childhood. It didn't start in the smoke of Pittsburgh. It started in the silence of Dunfermline, Scotland, in the 1840s. And the silence was the problem. Andrew was born into a house where the loom was the heartbeat. His father, William Carnegie, was a hand loom weaver. For generations, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the loom meant food. It meant dignity. It meant survival. But then, the industrial monsters came. Steam-powered factories began to churn out cloth faster and cheaper than any human hands could weave. The loom in the Carnegie cottage fell silent. This wasn't just a loss of income. It was an erasure of identity. Andrew watched his father, a proud man, walk into the house day after day, his shoulders slumped, holding unsold cloth that no one wanted. He watched his father beg for work at the factory gates, only to be turned away because his fingers were too old, too slow. The boy saw the light go out in his father's eyes. He saw his mother, Margaret, stitching shoes by candlelight until her fingers bled, just to buy a pot of soup. The lesson burned itself into Andrew's DNA. Poverty is not a misfortune. It is a crime. It is a beast that eats men alive, and you do not negotiate with it. You kill it, or it kills you. By 1848, they had no choice. They sold everything, the loom, the furniture, the last shreds of their heritage, to buy passage to America. They didn't travel like humans, they traveled like cargo. They were stuffed into the steerage of a ship called the Wiscasset. For 50 days, they lived in the breathless dark of the ship's belly, surrounded by the retching of seasick strangers, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the constant gnawing fear of typhus. When they finally dragged themselves onto the docks of New York, they didn't see streets paved with gold. They saw chaos. They moved swiftly to Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, a place the locals called Slabtown. It was a slum built on mud and misery, where the air was so thick with soot from the ironworks that the sun was just a rumor. There was no time for school. There was no time for childhood. The debt of the voyage hung over them like a blade. At age 13, Andrew walked into a cotton factory. His job was that of a bobbin boy. From sunrise to sunset, he ran through the deafening roar of machinery, changing spools of thread. The air was filled with cotton lint that coated his lungs, making him cough up white clumps at night. But the cotton factory was paradise compared to what came next. For $2 a week, he moved to the cellar of a bobbin factory to tend a steam engine. This was the abyss. He was alone in the dark, shoveling coal into a furnace mouth that roared with heat, while the pressure gauges ticked like time bombs. He began to have nightmares that would haunt him for decades. Dreams where the boiler exploded and tore his small body apart. He was trapped. He was a cog in a machine that didn't care if he lived or died. He looked at his father, who was now working in the cotton mill, broken and defeated, a ghost of a man. Andrew realized then that no one was coming to save him. If he stayed in the manual labor class, if he stayed a pair of hands, he would die in this cellar. He needed a way out. He didn't have money, he didn't have connections, he didn't have an education. But he had one thing that the soot hadn't covered yet: a ferocious, desperate charm, and a brain that was waking up to the realization that in America, you could rewrite your own name if you were willing to bleed for it. The escape hatch appeared in the form of a telegraph office, but getting in the door would require the first of many aggressive bluffs that would come to define his life. He wasn't going to wait for an opportunity. He was going to kick the door down. The year is 1849. Andrew Carnegie is 14 years old, and he is about to hustle his way out of the grave. He heard a rumor that the O'Reilly Telegraph office in Pittsburgh was looking for messenger boys. Now, understand the contrast. The boiler room was dark, hot, and smelled of death. The telegraph office was the Silicon Valley of the 1850s. It was clean. It hummed with electricity. It was where the news of the world arrived first. Andrew didn't just apply for the job. He besieged it. He put on his only suit frayed at the cuffs, but scrubbed clean by his mother, and marched in to see the manager. He promised to arrive earlier than any other boy, to run faster, to memorize every street in Pittsburgh. He was small, energetic, and desperate. He got the job. Pay, $2.50 a week. Suddenly, the boy from the cellar was walking through the front doors of banks, law firms, and newspaper offices. He wasn't just delivering messages, he was delivering himself. He memorized the faces and names of every businessman in the city. If a VIP walked down the street, Andrew would tip his cap and greet him by name. He was manufacturing luck. But his real genius wasn't in his legs, it was in his ears. In those days, telegraphy was a paper game. The machine clicked, a tape came out with dots and dashes, and you translated it. But Andrew noticed something. The clicks had a rhythm, a language. While the other boys were goofing off, Andrew sat by the receiver, listening. Click, clack, clack, click. One morning, the office was swamped. The tape machine jammed. Panic set in. But Andrew just picked up a pen and started writing. He wasn't looking at the tape. He was translating the sound directly from the air. He had become one of the only people in the country who could read by ear. He wasn't a messenger boy anymore. He was a wizard, and wizards attract attention. Enter Thomas Scott. If Andrew Carnegie was the future king, Thomas Scott was the kingmaker. Scott was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most powerful corporation in America. He needed a personal telegrapher and assistant. He needed someone smart, discreet, and hungry. He heard about the Scottish kid who could read the air. Scott hired him for $35 a month. This was the moment the door to the universe unlocked. Andrew moved into the inner sanctum of American power. He sat in the corner of Scott's office, invisible, watching how an empire was run. He saw how Scott negotiated, how he crushed competitors, how he moved men and iron across a continent like pieces on a chessboard. Andrew wasn't just an employee. He was a sponge. Then came the day that changed everything. The day the world stopped being about wages and started being about capital. It was a casual conversation. Thomas Scott, sitting on a train seat, leaned over to his young protege and said, "Andy, there's an opportunity coming up. 10 shares in a company called Adams Express. The widow of a shareholder wants to sell. It'll cost $500. $500. It might as well have been $5 million. The Carnegie family had zero savings. They lived week to week. A normal person would have said, "Thank you, Mr. Scott, but I can't afford it." Andrew didn't say that. He said, "I'll take it." He ran home, his heart hammering against his ribs. He told his mother, Margaret. This is where the immigrant survival instinct kicked in. Margaret didn't hesitate. She knew this was the lottery ticket. She mortgaged their small house. She took a loan. She scraped every penny of credit the family name could hold. They bet the roof over their heads on the word of Thomas Scott. Andrew handed over the money, shaking. And then, he waited. A few months later, a letter arrived for him at the railroad office. He opened it. Inside was a check for $10. It wasn't a wage. He hadn't worked for it. He hadn't sweated for it. He hadn't lifted a single finger. The money had been generated by other money. Years later, Carnegie would describe this as a religious experience. He stared at that check and cried. He yelled, "Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs!" The shackles of the laborer fell off him in that instant. He realized the great secret of the wealthy. You don't get rich by working. You get rich by owning. With Scott as his mentor, Andrew began to leverage everything. When the Civil War broke out, the bloodiest conflict in American history became the backdrop for his rapid ascent. While men died in the mud of Antietam and Gettysburg, the railroads were screaming for capacity to move troops and munitions. Thomas Scott was appointed Assistant Secretary of War, and who was his right-hand man? Andrew Carnegie. Andrew was placed in charge of the military railroads and telegraphs. He was in his mid-20s, directing the logistical nervous system of the Union Army. He saw the chaos of war, but he also saw the demand. The Union needed iron. It needed bridges. It needed rails. And Andrew Carnegie looked at the wooden bridges collapsing under the weight of heavy cannons and thought, iron. He started investing in iron bridge companies. He invested in locomotive works. He was using insider knowledge from his railroad position to buy into the suppliers that the railroad depended on. It was a conflict of interest that would land him in prison today, but in the 1860s, it was just good business. By the time the smoke of the Civil War cleared, Andrew Carnegie was no longer the starving boy from Slabtown. He was a capitalist worth nearly $500,000. He traveled to Europe, touring the grand cities as a victor. But it was on one of these trips to England that he saw something that made his investments in iron look like pocket change. He saw a flash of white light in a converter that was hotter than hellfire. He saw the future. And the future wasn't iron. The future was steel. The year is 1872. England. Andrew Carnegie is standing in a factory, staring at a pear-shaped vessel that looks like a cauldron for giants. It's called a Bessemer converter. He watches as a worker pours molten iron dull, heavy impurities swimming in the mix into the vessel. Then, a blast of air shoots up from the bottom. The reaction is violent. A volcano of sparks erupts into the ceiling. The roar is deafening. But when the liquid pours out, it isn't iron anymore. It is something new. It is steel. For thousands of years, steel was a luxury metal. It was used for swords, for cutlery, for jewelry. It was too expensive to build with. Bridges were made of iron, and iron was brittle. It cracked. It rusted. It failed. But Henry Bessemer had figured out how to make steel cheap. In that flash of light, Carnegie saw the death of his own fortune. All his money was tied up in iron factories, iron bridges, and iron rails. He realized instantly that iron was a walking corpse. The world was about to be rebuilt, and it would be rebuilt with this new metal. He rushed back to America with the zeal of a convert. He gathered his partner's men who were comfortable, men who were rich from the iron trade, and he told them the party was over. He said, "Gentlemen, we are selling everything. We are building a steel mill." They thought he was crazy, but Carnegie had a motto that he would later make famous. Put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. He named the new plant the Edgar Thomson Works, after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a shameless bit of flattery to ensure his first big customer. He found a spot of land at Braddock's Field, right where the railroads met the river. But then, disaster struck. The Panic of 1873. The American economy drove off a cliff. Banks collapsed. Railroads went bankrupt. The stock market closed for 10 days. Construction stopped across the country. Every sane businessman retreated. They hoarded cash. They fired workers. They hunkered down to survive the winter. Andrew Carnegie did the opposite. He looked at the chaos and smiled. Why? Because in a depression, everything is on sale. Labor was cheap. Materials were cheap. Competitors were desperate. While the rest of the world was screaming, "Save!" Carnegie was screaming, "Build!" He poured his entire fortune into the ground at Braddock. He drove the construction crews relentlessly. He knew that if he could finish the plant while the economy was dead, he would be the only one ready when it came back to life. And he was right. When the smoke of the Depression cleared, there was Carnegie, standing alone with the most advanced steel mill on the planet. But owning the mill wasn't enough. He had to run it better than anyone else. This is where Carnegie changed capitalism forever. In the 1870s, most factory owners were clueless. They knew their total profits, but they didn't know their specific costs. They ran their businesses on gut feeling. Carnegie ran his on chemistry and math. He hired scientists, Germans who wore lab coats to analyze the ore. They found that the cheap ore his competitors were buying was actually garbage, and the expensive ore yielded better steel. He realized that spending more upfront saved money in the end. He became obsessed with the unit cost. He didn't care if the factory made $1 million profit. He wanted to know exactly how much it cost to make a single ton of steel rails. If a manager proudly told him, "We made a huge profit this month, Andy," Carnegie would glare back and say, "Show me the cost sheets. Why did we use 2% more coal than last month?" He pitted his managers against each other. He sent the production numbers from one furnace to the foreman of the other, sparking a rivalry. Furnace A produced 50 tons today. Furnace B only did 45. What's wrong, boys? Are you tired? It was psychological warfare. It was the grind, and it worked. The price of steel rails dropped from $160 a ton to $20 a ton. Carnegie wasn't just undercutting the competition, he was suffocating them. British steelmakers, who had dominated the world for a century, couldn't compete. They packed up and went home. By the 1880s, Carnegie was the king of steel. The money was pouring in like a tidal wave. He was building castles in Scotland, buying newspapers, and dining with presidents. But a king needs a castle guard. He needs someone to do the dirty work that the king is too noble to touch. Carnegie wanted to be loved. He wanted to be the benevolent Andy, the friend of the working man. But he also wanted ruthless efficiency. He wanted wages cut. He wanted 12-hour shifts. He wanted total control. He couldn't be both the saint and the executioner. So, he found a man who enjoyed the executioner's mask. He found Henry Clay Frick, and together, they would march toward the darkest chapter in American labor history. A chapter written in blood on the banks of the Monongahela River. If Andrew Carnegie was the architect of the American dream, Henry Clay Frick was its demolition expert. Frick was a man carved out of coal. He was the king of coke, the fuel needed to melt iron. He didn't care about libraries. He didn't care about being liked. He cared about winning. Carnegie bought a majority stake in Frick's company and made him chairman of Carnegie Steel. It was a deal with the devil, signed in ink and destined to be paid in blood. The target was the Homestead Works. By 1892, Homestead was the jewel of the Carnegie Empire. But it had a problem. It was the stronghold of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest unions in the country. These men believed they had a right to the jobs they performed. They believed they were partners in production. Carnegie believed they were costs to be cut. Publicly, Carnegie wrote essays defending the right of workers to organize. He smiled for the cameras. He played the benevolent father figure. But privately, he sent a message to Frick that was colder than the winter wind. The plant must become non-union. Then, Andrew Carnegie did the most cowardly thing of his life. He ran away. As the contract negotiations approached, Carnegie boarded a ship for Scotland. He retreated to his estate at Loch Rannoch, miles from the nearest telegraph office. He told Frick he was out of reach. He washed his hands like Pontius Pilate and left the hammer in Frick's hand. Frick wasted no time. He built a 3-mile-long wooden fence around the mill, topped with barbed wire. He drilled sniper holes in it. The workers called it Fort Frick. He announced wage cuts. He locked the workers out. The town of Homestead erupted. Thousands of workers and their families surrounded the plant. They weren't just striking, they were seizing the means of production. Frick countered with a private army. He hired the Pinkerton detective agency mercenaries known for breaking strikes with rifle butts. On the night of July 5th, 1892, under the cover of a thick fog, 2 barges packed with 300 armed Pinkerton agents drifted down the Monongahela River. They thought they were sneaking in. They were wrong. A tugboat whistle shrieked through the darkness. The alarm was raised. Men, women, and children rushed to the riverbank, tearing down the fence, armed with rocks, old muskets, and fury. When the Pinkertons tried to land, a shot rang out. Then, hell opened up. For 12 hours, a civil war raged on the riverbank. The workers rolled a flaming wagon down the hill toward the barges. They pumped oil into the river and set the water on fire. They brought out a cannon from the town square. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered, the river ran red. 9 workers were dead. 7 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens were wounded. The surrendered agents were forced to run a gauntlet through the town, where they were beaten by the enraged widows of the steel workers. The news hit the world like a bomb. War in Pennsylvania. In Scotland, Carnegie was hiding. He read the telegrams with shaking hands. The press turned on him. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote, 3 months ago, Andrew Carnegie was a man who was envied by the toiling masses. Today, he is an object of mingled pity and contempt. He had won, but at what cost? The Union was broken. The National Guard marched in and took the plant back. Wages were slashed. The 12-hour day was reinstated. The men returned to the furnaces, defeated, their spirit crushed under the heel of the man who claimed to be their friend. Carnegie returned to America, a pariah. He tried to blame Frick. He claimed he would have handled it differently, but the blood didn't wash off. For the next 8 years, Carnegie buried his guilt in work. He drove the profits higher and higher. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. He was an industrial god, but he was tired. He was 65 years old. The game had lost its flavor. And a new titan had entered the arena. J.P. Morgan. Morgan was the banker of bankers. He wanted to bring order to the chaos of the steel market. He wanted to buy Carnegie out. The negotiation didn't take place in a boardroom with lawyers and contracts. It happened at a dinner party. Carnegie wasn't even there. He sent his right-hand man, Charles Schwab, to dine with Morgan. Schwab spoke eloquently about the future of a supertrust, a monopoly of steel. Morgan listened, puffing on his cigar, his eyes unreadable. Finally, Morgan said, "Go ask Andy for his price." The next day, Carnegie sat at his desk. He picked up a pencil and a piece of paper. He scribbled a number. There was no calculation, no audit, just a number that felt big enough to buy freedom. $480 million. In today's money, that is roughly $300 billion. It was more than the entire budget of the United States federal government.
He handed the paper to Schwab. Schwab took it to Morgan.
Morgan looked at the paper. He didn't blink. He didn't negotiate. He simply said, "I accept." A few days later, Carnegie went to Morgan's office to shake hands. The deal was done. The immigrant boy who had slept in a rat-infested attic, who had stood on a crate to reach the steam engine, was now cash-rich beyond the comprehension of emperors and kings. As they shook hands, Morgan leaned in and said the words that would ring in Carnegie's ears for the rest of his life.
"Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you on being the richest man in the world."
Carnegie walked out onto Wall Street. He was free. He had won the game of capitalism completely and utterly. But as he walked away, the silence of Dunfermline and the screams of Homestead were walking right beside him. He had the money. Now, he had to figure out how to buy back his soul. Andrew Carnegie had spent 40 years accumulating gold. He would spend the last 18 trying to shovel it out the door. He didn't retire to a beach. He didn't buy yachts. He went to war with his own fortune. He sat in his study in New York, surrounded by piles of requests, treating philanthropy with the same cold, hard aggression he used to crush his competitors. He wrote an essay that dropped like a hammer on the upper class. It was called The Gospel of Wealth. In it, he declared a new commandment for the rich. He said that a man who hoards his wealth is a traitor to his community. He wrote the sentence that would become his epitaph. The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. He was terrified of that disgrace. He was terrified that history would only remember the blood at Homestead and not the fire in his belly. So he began to build monuments to his own redemption. He turned to the one thing that had saved him when he was a dirty, starving boy in Pennsylvania: books. He remembered Colonel Anderson, a local man who had opened his private library to working boys on Saturday nights. He remembered the feeling of holding a book and realizing that knowledge was the only ladder out of the cellar. So Carnegie went on a building spree that the world had never seen. He didn't just write checks, he built infrastructure. In small towns across America, across Scotland, across the English-speaking world, buildings began to rise. Solid, brick, permanent. Library, library, library. 2,509 of them. He put a library in Fiji. He put a library in the Seychelles. He put libraries in towns that didn't even have paved roads. He demanded that the towns commit to paying for the upkeep. He wasn't giving a handout. He was striking a bargain. He provided the shell. They had to provide the soul. But the money was coming in faster than he could spend it. The interest alone on his fortune was a tidal wave. He bought 7,000 church organs, joking that he would endow the curse of theology by helping churches play better music. He built Carnegie Hall, a temple for the arts. He founded the Carnegie Mellon University. Yet, the shadow of Homestead never left him. When he dedicated the library in Braddock, right next to his steel mill, the workers stood in the back, silent. They looked at the grand building, and then they looked at their paychecks. One worker famously said, "We asked for bread, and he gave us a stone." They didn't want books. They wanted the money he had stolen from their wages. They wanted the fathers and brothers who had died on the riverbank. Carnegie tried to ignore the whispers. He turned his eyes to a bigger prize: world peace. He believed that he, the man who had forged the steel for battleships, could single-handedly end war. He built a peace palace in The Hague. He wined and dined the Kaiser of Germany. He truly believed that civilization had evolved past violence. Then came 1914. The guns of August roared. The steel he had pioneered was turned into shells,
tanks, and machine guns. The world tore itself apart in the First World War. It broke him. The star-spangled Scotchman retreated into silence. He stopped writing in his diary. The optimism that had carried him from the weaving cottage to the pinnacle of power finally ran out. He died in 1919, 2 months after the Treaty of Versailles. But when the will was read, the final tally came in. He had given away $350 million. In his bank account, the richest man in the world had only $30 million left. He had almost won his race. Today, the smoke over Pittsburgh has cleared. The blast furnaces of the Edgar Thomson Works still burn, but the empire has fractured into history. Yet, you cannot walk through modern America without stepping in Andrew Carnegie's footprint. Every time a child walks into a public library to finish their homework because they don't have internet at home, that is Andrew Carnegie. Every time a skyscraper defies gravity, held up by a skeleton of steel, that is Andrew Carnegie. And every time a billionaire pledges to give away their fortune before they die, chasing the ghost of disgrace, that is Andrew Carnegie. He was a man of violent contradictions. He was the ruthless tyrant who crushed the working man to save a penny, and he was the saint who gave every penny back to lift the common man up. He was the arsonist and the firefighter, the poison and the cure. He proved that in America, a starving immigrant boy can own the world. But he also left us with the question that still haunts the halls of capitalism. Can you ever really own anything if you have to sell your soul to get it?